So, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining this event where we are asking whether Black Lives Matter in the media. This event is part of this year's Media Democracy Festival, organised by the Media Reform Coalition. And the Media Reform Coalition works to bring together civil society groups, researchers, and media practitioners to develop policies and campaign for media reform in light of a communications environment that continues to be dominated by a handful of large, powerful organisations and is characterised by insufficient diversity and accountability. So I'm Dr. Omega Douglas from Goldsmiths College, University of London, where I teach journalism theory and practice, and I do research on media, race, international development discourse and racism, and I'm chairing today's discussion. And I'm joined by a really fantastic panel of speakers, each of whom will speak for about 10 minutes in the order I'm introducing them. And then we'll take questions from our virtual audience. If you would like to ask a question, please add it to the comment stream on the platform you're watching on, and do add it at any point during the talk, and we'll take as many questions as we can in the time we have at the end of all our panelists' talks. So our panelists are Chenjerai Kumanyika, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Journalism and Media at Rutgers University. He also commits acts of podcasting and organising, and his research and teaching focuses on power, race, and promotional culture in the creative industries. In addition to being a proud moth storyteller, Chenjerai co-created and co-hosted Gimlet Media's Peabody Award-winning Uncivil podcast and co-hosts On Scene on Radio's widely influential seasons on Seeing White and the History of American Democracy. His writing appears in a variety of scholarly and journalistic outlets, and Chenjerai organises with 215 People's Alliance, the Media Inequality and Change Centre, Philadelphia Debt Collective, and he continues to serve on Street Poets Board as well as the Moth Board. Kerry-Anne Mendoza is our other panelist, our second panelist, and she is co-founder and editor at large of The Canary and author of Austerity, the Demolition of the Welfare State and the Rise of the Zombie Economy. And last but not least, Sarah J. Jackson is Presidential Associate Professor at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania and co-director of the Media Inequality and Change Centre. And she studies how media, journalism and technology are used by and represent marginalised publics, with a focus on how communication arising from Black, feminist and activist spaces contribute to US progress. So we're incredibly excited to have these fantastic panelists with us today. And I think it's really important to begin this discussion by noting that our panelists are based in the UK and the USA. And what a moment to be having a discussion about the treatment of Black lives in the media on both sides of the Atlantic. And no, we didn't coordinate this with Oprah. In case anyone missed it, Meghan Markle caused a media storm when, around this time last week, as millions watched her and Harry's interview with Oprah, Meghan Markle highlighted, amongst other things, the racist treatment she's been subjected to by the British press. This sadly was really not a shocking revelation at all for many of us, including Black and Asian people and others from minority ethnic groups in the UK, who are all too familiar with the ongoing racism perpetrated by much of the dominant British press. In fact, so familiar a reality this is that when the Society of Editors, a UK trade organisation which acts to protect the interests of British news media organisations, put out a statement following the Meghan and Harry interview saying the UK media is not bigoted, over 200 media practitioners of colour, myself included, signed an open letter describing the Society of Editors statement as laughable and an illustration of an industry in denial. Editors of The Guardian, the FT, and HuffPost were also quick to object to the Society of Editors statement. And ITV news anchor Charlene White pulled out of hosting the National Press Awards, which is organised by the Society, telling Ian Murray, the Society's executive director, to quote Charlene White, "Your organisation approached me to become a judge for its awards and to work alongside you because at that time it was hugely lacking in terms of being a fair reflection, of the UK population. In other words," she wrote, "the nominations and winners list involve very few non-white journalists. This is not an unusual scenario, unfortunately," she wrote. "So you told me you wanted to change that. In fact, we spoke about it at length. But here's the thing," she wrote. "I only work with organisations who practice what they preach. My time is precious, so I'd rather not waste it. Perhaps it's best for you to look elsewhere for a host for your awards this year. Perhaps someone," she wrote, "whose views align with yours, that the UK press is the one institution in the entire country who has a perfect record on race." Ian Murray, the Society's executive director, has now resigned, and the National Press Awards has been postponed following the Society's statement denying racism in the press. But this, of course, is a far bigger issue than just one individual or organisation. This is about systemic, structural racism. And what happened last week signals an opportunity for long overdue change in an industry where, in the UK, just 0.2% of journalists are Black, compared with 3% of the UK population, and just 0.4% are Muslim, compared with almost 5% of the population. Meanwhile, 94% of journalists are white, compared with 86% of the population of England and Wales. And research by Women in Journalism found that of 111 voices quoted on the front pages of British newspapers in a random week last year, just one was a Black person. And out of 174 bylines on stories that week, not one single one was a Black journalist, and just 6 were by journalists from other ethnic minorities. So change needs to happen, and fast. The problem is, as those of us who've been around for long enough know, there have been endless signals and opportunities for change over many decades, from the launch of the Black British newspaper The Voice post the 1980s riots, which was a response to the under and misrepresentation of Black people in Britain, to the 1999 Macpherson inquiry into institutional racism, which led to unprecedented scrutiny of public and private British institutions and their race equality policies following the racist murder of Black British teenager Stephen Lawrence. As I point out in my research on the experiences of Black and brown journalists in the UK press, the Macpherson inquiry was a bittersweet period for Black journalists, like Black Lives Matter is today, because it put race on the agenda in the cruelest of ways and made Black journalists seen. Those of us who'd been calling for greater diversity in mainstream media for years also used the Macpherson reports as an opportunity to urge senior journalists and editors who were writing about the institutional racism the report formally uncovered within the Metropolitan Police to reflect on equality within their own institutions. And there has been ongoing tireless work by diversity, inclusion, and anti-racist campaigners, both in the United States and in the UK, calling for change within the dominant press and putting forward recommendations and strategies on how to achieve that. Yet here we are. So it's incredibly hard not to feel that there's a willful complacency on the part of too many in positions of power who can enact change, but consistently fail to do so in sustainable, meaningful ways. So the question for today is, do Black Lives Matter in the media? And I'm going to hand over to Chenjerai to kick us off.
Hey, everyone. I just want to say thank you so much for having me. And, I'm really excited to be here. First of all, I'm not going to talk for very long, but I just want to very quickly thank everyone who put this together. Often when we're doing political organizing, or if we're doing this kind of media organizing, it takes, all kinds of work. And I want to make sure all those people are recognized. I also want to shout out, all the activists and organizers out there in the UK, people who are working and kind of sacrificing to push us forward and make, both Britain and the UK and make America something that it's never been before, rather than trying to go back to anything. And so I just want to just express that love and that spirit. And there's another thing I want to also express, because I'm going to offer some critical views on the state of our media. And I just want to say that, there is a kind of class of journalists who I would say often are younger, and then also journalists across all ages and identities who are about the radical project of media transformation, but are often fighting within institutions and not being recognized. And so I want to just say, I recognize you. And when we critique your institutions, we're also recognizing your work and to try to create more space for that work. So let me just say, we're asking this question about, do Black Lives Matter in the media? And I just want to recognize that this is often framed in very limited terms about, questions of individual racism. So I want to expand this question out a bit and say that we're asking this question during a time when empire is in crisis. The British Empire is in crisis. The American empire, although we don't think of ourselves as an empire, is in crisis. And what I mean by that is that we were promised that markets and pluralism would bring us to an end of history kind of status where we wouldn't have these problems anymore. We wouldn't have labor problems. We wouldn't have race problems. We wouldn't have problems around gender, sexuality, or disability, because the market would solve those things. And actually, more market-like institutions would solve these problems. But what we've seen, especially in the past year, is that, those kinds of approaches have not been able to solve issues of not just systemic racism, but, state terror, racialized state terror in the UK that we see with the police, right? The police not being broken or mistrust, but actually doing what they were created to do long ago, both in the UK and in the US and elsewhere. We see that when it comes to the crisis of ecology and healthcare, markets and pluralism, these kind of pluralist approaches certainly don't help. And markets actually are part of what got us into this problem and keep us in it, with these extractive industries, right? And so I just want to say that these larger problems of empire are also, and these crises of empire are central to the crisis of the media and mass communication, because, mass communication, as we know, and by definition, empire is constituted by the industry, cultural industries, media industries, communicative industries. That's the only way that the empire can sort of communicate with its periphery. And so what we see is that. Now, in the midst of that, there's been different kinds of responses to this moment where the traditional discourses are unable to respond to crisis. One that I don't want to talk about too much is an overtly racist, fascist kind of response that was very much at play in Brexit in the UK, and also was definitely in play in the US with the guy that we just got rid of. And his followers, that's very much still with us. And that crisis has its reflection in media, especially in social media of the kind that are playing continue to play a crucial role. But the other thing, the other kind of response is sort of another kind of market pluralist response, where we actually embrace parts of the crisis, right? We embrace parts of the critique around race, around diversity, what's called diversity in the media. And we try to put the right kinds of faces on the media. We try to just make sure that we have the right people in front of the camera, even if their jobs are precarious. We try to make sure that we have the right amount of women and trans people and all these other kinds of things, right? And we make some surface changes without actually getting at the core of what actually is producing this crisis, right? And so you've seen, like, for example, after this summer, right, where you saw the tremendous uprisings in 60 countries across the world, partially in response to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, but really people recognizing that Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and the brother that got killed over in the UK are actually the tip of the spear, tip of the iceberg of a larger crisis, racialized crisis of empire, right? And so the media really did try to step up in different ways. We saw that in the US and we saw that in, in various places. But some of the responses that were being offered were really insufficient. And I think that when you look at how they tried to deal with crisis in this moment, you see priorities emerging. And that's what I really want to draw our attention to when we ask the question, do Black Lives Matter in the media? Because maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the real question is, what does matter, right? Based on the response to this crisis. And what we see is that Black content matters, right? Like people love to have, we see media companies, some of this very same companies who are really constitutive parts of white supremacist patriarchal empire actually leveraging Black content in new ways. Now, this is a nuanced question because people, including myself, get opportunities when this happens. It's important. And so we're seeing a wave of really interesting media in the cultural industries, and I would argue some better journalism on some topics, right? But and you also see the same thing in public media institutions, right? There's some touching around the edges of trying to get the right people in there. Although it's interesting that the BBC chose to respond to the crisis by making sure there were no people of color on its board, which is interesting. And so I think we have to look at what the priorities are driving that, because if we purely talk about anti-racism, right? I mean, I guess we can't say that no one will admit that they're racist because, we do have this fascist piece of this. But when you look at the rationale that was given for the choices that the BBC made, for example, these were market decisions, right? There was the language of more value that was going to be created by the kinds of reorganizing that happened, right? When we see people being laid off, right? While some of the top people in British public media are making £2 million salaries, right? And you see hundreds of people being laid off. That's also has to be considered as part of this response. So we see that Black content matters, but maybe not Black lives. We see that Black faces on the media matter, but maybe not really Black lives. We see cheap access to Black precarious labor, that matters, but maybe not Black lives. And we have to really be clear about those mechanisms and those terms. And, I just want to say that I came into podcasting when I made Uncivil and Seen on Radio in an earlier phase of this crisis, where people were trying to address questions of diversity. And I made the sort of political and ethical compromise of working within Gimlet, which is now owned by Spotify. And I think if we look at the struggle that you're seeing in podcasting at several institutions within Spotify's network, for example, you see that struggle playing out. You see, on the one hand, private commercial media trying to actually argue that they're more advanced than public media, that they have more of a role to play, right, which is false. While also the people who work in those institutions are unionizing, right? And actually on the verge of really maybe trying to push back against a major media conglomerate. So I think we have to be clear about these mechanisms. And I know I'm running out of time, but it's one thing to celebrate the kind of content that we're making, and there is some interesting content, but I think we have to be really clear about where the struggle is. What are the sites of struggle around labor, around healthcare, around patriarchy, institutionally, not in just in sort of the attitudes of individuals, and proceed in that way, looking at what priorities reflect what really does matter to these institutions and to empire. And that's what I'll start, and then I'm happy to say more in the Q&A.
That's great. Thanks so much, Chenjerai, for kicking us off. So over to you, Kerry, and then we will come to Sarah at the end. Okay, thank you.
Good evening. So firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of the festival, and hats off to the Media Reform Coalition and all the partners for this, and all of the organisers and everyone who showed up this evening. I guess I wanted to preface my comments this evening just by saying, this has been really an excruciating week on the back of an excruciating year, on the back of an excruciating decade. For people of colour, and particularly women of colour. And I think it's really important when we're having this conversation this evening that we just remember where everybody's at with that. And I'm particularly grateful actually to be having this conversation this evening. I think it couldn't be more important. and I'm proud to be a part of it. So thank you for creating the space in which we can have this conversation. I guess I wanted to give people a kind of a little view into my world, really, as a, you know, lucky enough to be born into this world as a working class, gay woman who's also autistic, and a person of color. And so there's, you know, when you have all of that inside your identity, I think it gives you a very personal insight into how intersectionality works and how these different types of marginalization are weaponized against each other by white supremacy, by patriarchy, by ableism, and other systems, and actually how capitalism itself really kind of depends on it and encourages it. And so when we ask, you know, do Black Lives matter to the media? Well, they do, but as Chenjerai said, they matter in the sense of virtue signaling, of performative liberalism, of torture porn, of clickbait. They matter in that sense. But one thing I've learned from helping to co-found a media outlet from nothing is that every excuse I've ever heard from an organization about how impossible it is to cure this seemingly intractable problem of representation in media is just nonsense. It's a lie. It's a lie people tell themselves to cover the fact that they simply are not committed to equality. They're not committed to equality in a lot of ways, but I think, you know, race itself being weaponized in services of capitalism is a really key means of taking an opposition in the terms of the working class, which is a majority, and dividing it into competing factions, and to convince them all that the only chance they have of improving their own personal conditions must come at the expense of someone else. And so we all start fighting each other over those scraps from the table, rather than actually realizing that if we were to put aside these petty and arbitrary prejudices and unite, then actually we could actually work together to create a country and a continent or a world that was based on equality and justice and truth. That's the reality of the situation as I've seen it. So when we started setting up the Canary, obviously I brought my experience to it. And one of the things I'd noticed that I think other people of colour will know from their lived experience too, is that it's one thing getting in the door of institutions that are racist. Our press is institutionally racist. Most of our professions are institutionally racist. They're part of a white establishment and a patriarchal establishment. So how do you get in? Well, if you get in, often it comes at a price, and that price is conformity. So even if you take an institutionally racist organization, it will be extraordinarily difficult for any person within that organization who is gay or black or disabled to fight doggedly for the equality that they seek in the wider world. And many of us simply abandon that dream altogether and just go for this sort of individualized vision of anti-racism, which is just, well, I made it, you know, so that's a success for anti-racism because I made it, rather than, is this country now fairer to black people as a result of me and other black people being a part of these institutions? And we see this everywhere. You know, we have Priti Patel as Home Secretary. Is this country now a safer place for people of colour because Priti Patel is Home Secretary? No. Like, one of the ways Priti Patel became Home Secretary was that she's probably out racisting half the cabinet. You know, that's the reality that is a part of what happened. So it wasn't enough for me when we were founding the Canary and for my co-founders to just say, well, you know, we'll get the representation right. It was more, no, how do we make sure that we're not a racist institution? knowingly or unknowingly, consciously or unconsciously. How do we do that? And one of the things is to begin with representation. That really helps because the more people of, the different variety of voices you have in a conversation, the fewer your blind spots are. It's just as simple as that. But then it's about, well, when you put up a job application, there's no people of color in it. So you make sure, so you're constantly needing to think about dealing not only with the sort of racism you see out there, also the internalized racism. And I personally have found this an incredibly rewarding and amazing journey to go on, to actually build an institution from scratch, and through conversation and through collaboration and cooperation, constantly challenge ourselves to make sure that any kind of that stuff that is crept in is shunted out. And, we ask, do you feel safe here? Are you having issues here? Is there any way that we can make this organization more true to its vision and values? And then when we're told that stuff, we then do it, and we do it quickly. And we operate with a budget that is less than the chief executive salary at The Guardian. We're not doing this with a huge amount of resources, but we're able to do things like, make sure our work patterns don't prejudice against people because of ableist issues or parental issues, or the time people will pray or anything like that. It's a constant, all of these little things that people see as the way it's done. Well, the way it's done is institutionally racist, institutionally sexist, and institutionally ableist. So how do we make sure that we don't replicate those? Well, you have to do things fundamentally differently. You can't just do things the same way they've always been done, but try to invite a few of these people in, like they're guests. That's not how it works. And I think that what you then have is, when you're reporting stories, all of your stories are reported as things that are happening to us. And when you have a press that is almost universally white, even when it deigns to report on an issue that affects Black people, it is reported as something that is happening to them. The center moves, the focus pulls. And that's a profoundly different level of urgency and connection and intimacy to a story and to the people affected by that story than if it's happening to us. It's very different, and it gives a different impact to the audience who's listening to it or reading it. And that's the sort of stuff that you need to pick up. And I just wanted to pick up a current case which is really distressed me recently, which is, obviously, we have the Sarah Everard murder, which in and of itself is an absolutely tragic event, and the way that the police behaved at the vigil, breaking it up, attacking people, arresting women for the crime of, complaining about being, hurt and violated by literally a police officer. And there's this complete media kind of coverage of this story. It's everywhere. Even people I know who don't really follow the media closely know her name, they know her face, they're having a personal grief experience attached to her loss. I was saying on social media the other day, now imagine if, when the police found Sarah Everard's body, they posed for selfies with it and then sent it to a WhatsApp group of other police officers for fun. And then imagine the press forgot about it within a week. It just wouldn't happen. But that's actually what happened to us. I mean, just last summer, 2 sisters of colour were murdered in a Wembley park, and that's what happened. The police charged with discovering their bodies, the police charged with protecting them, decided instead, so separate were they from these women that they viewed them as objects of fun and shared that around. And there wasn't even a massive outcry about it. And even when I shared it, there were so many people on that message saying, what? How did this happen? I've never heard about this. So the reason you've never heard about it is probably a white editor somewhere decided that the story wasn't relatable. And so once we got past the clickbait of the gore of it, they knew people would read it because it was shocking. But it wasn't a story that they felt was important enough, relatable enough, urgent enough to continue covering, to create the kind of furore which demands accountability and change. And that's where we are. So do Black Lives Matter to the media? Not unless they can monetize them. No. And that's not to say that there aren't people in the media that do care. But we're looking at this as an institutional issue. And if we're going to change it, I think it needs to change as much from outside as from within. You know, a new independent media is rising, is growing, and I think we have the ability to school people really on how easy this is to do, so that the only option that people are left with is wherever this isn't happening, it isn't intended to be happening.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kerry-Anne. Okay, so I'm conscious of time. We will move on to Sarah. And please post your questions via the chat, and then I will be putting them to our panelists after Sarah's talk. Okay, over to you, Sarah. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here, and I just want to echo Chenjerai's comments about appreciating all the people behind the scenes who are doing the production and the tech and all of that. Really grateful for that. I want to talk a little bit about how we talk about this question of if Black lives matter in the media, and something specifically that my work has tried to intervene in, which is that often when we talk about race and media, and particularly when we're thinking about questions of inclusion, exclusion, representation, what stories get told, what stories don't get told, we very rightly and correctly spend a lot of our time on critique of mainstream. And when I say mainstream, these are generally white media institutions, both historically and contemporarily, and the ways in which they misrepresent or exclude or otherwise marginalize Black stories. And that is, of course, a very important thing to acknowledge. And as Omega mentioned, we're still working on getting many of these institutions to acknowledge that they have a problem in terms of the ways in which Black stories are or aren't told, or Black folks are or aren't represented. But one thing that I really want to sort of push on this point is that despite the fact of what corporate or mainstream or white-run media say and do when it comes to the question of Black lives and their worth and stories, we already have the models in existence, and have actually had the models in existence for a really long time, of what it looks like to tell complex, nuanced, compassionate, fully fleshed out stories about Blackness, Black experience, and Black lives. And that is because we have Black media makers. And so right now I'm working on a book project about Black media makers in the American context. And, you know, what you see in every era, and I would argue that this is true across the world, is that even in the face of some of the most, violent exclusion and suppression of Black ideas and experiences and identities in media, there have been Black media makers who have been truth tellers and really at the forefront of pushing forward reform and pushing forward democratic goals and pushing forward new ways of thinking and talking about race. And these folks are doing that now, and we need to listen to them. But they've always been doing that. And so I always fear that we erase this work by not talking and celebrating it enough. And so, there are countless thousands and thousands and thousands, probably millions of examples of this throughout history, of course, but some of the more familiar ones in the US might be the work of Ida B. Wells and her work covering lynching and lynch mobs in the US, to the risk of her own safety, but the way in which that actually changed policy and politics in the United States around justice, and questions of justice and what justice meant to Black people and to white people. Similarly, the role that Black-run radio stations played in the 1950s, subversively spreading news about civil rights actions and organizing. A great example from the South African context, of course, is the role that media played in the global anti-apartheid movement, where Black media makers were for decades using underground networks and alternative media, newspapers, radios, books, and more to spread and solidify, public sentiment across the globe against the apartheid establishment. And so in doing all this, Black media makers have really not just been at the forefront of political struggle, but they've also had to be among the most creative and innovative of media makers, because, of course, when the stories you're telling are considered subversive, and when the voices you're trying to center have been subalternated, then you have to become creative about how to produce media and what stories to tell. And so I think, to Kerry-Anne's point about trying to move the center, right, and trying to dismantle that us versus them kind of ideology within the media that centers whiteness and puts Blackness at the extreme margins, we have this model and we can follow this model and we can follow sort of these creative and innovative ideas that have already been and continue to be developed by Black media makers in many platforms. And so, for example, in my last book, which just came out last year, #activism, we studied Twitter and we studied the way in the US context that Black Americans told stories about police brutality, about systemic racism, about intersectional issues, specifically violence faced by Black women. And the fact that often these were stories that traditional media and white-run media either ignored or only told when they couldn't avoid it, and always fell back on sort of problematic frames for. But when ordinary Black folks used a platform and used a technology to tell these stories in a different kind of way and to insist on a different kind of politics, what we saw was that those mainstream media institutions had to move the center a little bit towards that version of the story. And so, of course, this isn't to say, and by no means is, the internet even close to being a liberatory space. It's a military technology. As Chenjerai talked about, many media institutions are very much the product of empire, the institutions themselves and the technologies. And yet there are Black folks all over the world remaking and reusing these technologies to tell stories about how Black lives matter. And they're not only telling those stories in relation to things like violence and things like harm and things like oppression. They're telling stories of Black joy. They're telling stories of Black creativity. They're telling stories of Black family, Black humanity, and all the kinds of different stories of Blackness that have historically been excluded from mainstream spaces. And one of the things that we have found, myself and my colleagues in our research, is that actually does create change, that even in the face of the sort of ignoring and oppression that Black media makers often face, that they can intervene in the ways that stories are being told in these institutions, both through working through these legacy institutions and, of course, through creating alternative media and alternative models for media. And so, I think I'll just close by saying that, this is happening all around us. In the United States, we have a cadre of Black media makers. Chenjerai is a great example of that, who have chosen to push from both inside, white media institutions and traditional media institutions, and by developing something wholly new from outside of them, and really challenging the centering of whiteness and the logics of white perspectives and white supremacy that are so central to so many media systems. And, the list of this could go on, but in the US, I'm thinking of examples like Nicole Hannah-Jones' 1619 Project at the New York Times, journalist Wesley Lowery, who's now at CBS News, but who was at the Washington Post and formulated the Fatal Force Project, which counted police murders in the United States, and many, many others. And of course, there's a long list of predecessors and contemporary folks doing this that have changed the way we talk about race and racism, not only on a national, but on an international scale. And then, of course, I'm also thinking about the folks who have just skipped that mainstream gatekeeping altogether. I'm thinking of the increasing rise and influence of the Black blogosphere, of Black produced and created podcasts across the world. And I'm thinking, for example, of my friend AJ Christian, who collaboratively built a web platform called Open Television that creates and produces intersectional television for people of color and queer people, that is outside of the creative and economic control of the sort of mainstream institutions that we're used to having to work within in the media. And so we have many more examples of this. And so one of the things I, of course, want to encourage as we talk about this question of Black Lives Mattering in the media is that it's not only important that the media institutions that are the problem change, but I think it's important that those of us that are having the conversation about the problem make sure to point out that we have already existent models to follow of how to center Black stories, how to tell more human stories, and et cetera. And so I think one thing that media organizations who are really committed to changing, and of course they have to get committed to changing first, is to not just acknowledge, of course, that they've been complicit in the marginalization of Black voices historically, but that they continue to be complicit in that contemporarily. And of course, Omega talked about it's tough to get these organizations to acknowledge that, but they need to also take concrete steps to center Black stories, Black voices, Black media makers, Black communities now. And so, this isn't, as Kerry-Anne said, it very much isn't just token inclusion, a talking head here, a talking head there, when that inclusion requires assimilation into sort of white normative ways of thinking, but rather listening and centering the imaginations and creativity of Black communities and Black histories and Black storytellers in the media that is being produced for audiences. And, I think there's another conversation to have then about who the imagined audience is, because so often the mistake being made by these legacy institutions is assuming that their audience is only a white audience that can only understand Blackness in narrow ways, when of course in the 21st century, this is just no longer the case. So I think I'll stop there for the sake of time, and looking forward to engaging with the other folks on the panel and with questions. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you so much. So we have loads of questions that have come in, and we've sadly not got a huge amount of time. And I think actually, this is one of the last questions. I'll come to the panel, to the questions that are on the stream in a minute, but I think it's quite important just to pick up on where Sarah left off and talk about solutions, because, as you rightly said, Sarah, quite often when we're talking about race and racism in the media, obviously, if we're talking about racism, the instant thing is to critique, but actually you've kind of, positively flipped it, and kind of you're looking at the, positive incursions that people are making, particularly in America. And Kerry, it'd be interesting to see what you feel about kind of successes on that front in the UK. And someone has posted on the chat, Galdem, along with, organizations like yours, Kerry, are doing great things. But what I'm quite keen, and picking up on what you were talking about, Chenjerai, about empire being kind of central to the crisis of the media, and perhaps this is something you can all discuss a bit. When we're thinking of solutions to the ongoing issue of racism within dominant media in the UK and the US, and, you know, I'm thinking of your Uncivil podcast as well, Chenjerai, and its engagement with forgotten histories in America and its censoring of slavery and racism in the story of the US. And that, of course, obviously speaks to calls to decolonize the curriculum on both sides of the Atlantic, and, of course, in countries like South Africa and other countries as well. And therefore, to enhance everyone's understanding of our national and global stories, and therefore of ourselves. And my feeling personally is that until that shift happens within our education systems right from the get-go, from, you know, little children all the way through to university, a permanent shift within dominant media institutions is unlikely to happen, just simply because the knowledge and understanding of race and racism being a shared story, and one that's integral to all of our realities, is going to remain lacking. So I'm just quite curious to know what all your thoughts are really on the importance of education from an early age regarding issues, huge topics like empire, which are often very sidelined in curriculum, in terms of, you know, how important you feel those are, that education on that front is key to constructing more diverse and inclusive media landscape. So Chenjerai, maybe you can begin, as you were the first to talk.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I have to say, I have so much respect for the work of my fellow panelists. I really just want to listen to you all the whole time. So I'll try to be brief. I think when we think about solutions and what to do about all of this, I think it's important to recognize, I definitely want to echo the things that have already been said that Kerry-Anne is actually not just saying, but living and acting with the Canary, which has so much wonderful things going on. And what Sarah said, but I think of it on three different levels when we think about solutions. I think about it on a personal level, where we maybe as media practitioners or people working in institutions, both central and sort of more peripheral or mainstream, however you want to look at it. There's the personal level, there's the culture at which we look at both the culture of those institutions and the cultural level that you're talking about more broadly when it comes to education, right? And then there's the structural level, right, which now gets into policy, the character of our movements that can push for this change, and also the spectrum of institutions, so that we have organization institutions like the Canary, you know, kind of pushing the envelope. So in terms of education, one thing one just note I want to make is that when the conversation about race is also framed in terms of different perspectives. Black people or women or, you know, people with disabilities bring different perspectives to the table, and that's why it's important, almost like it's a garnish on some primary dish. And I think that, you know, one of the reasons I like to deal with history in the podcast work that I do, whether we're talking about the history of the Civil War or these other things of race, is because it kind of gets us past that and helps us to understand something that James Baldwin said. James Baldwin said, if I'm not in your history, you're not in it. Right. And what he meant was that we're not talking about diversity and race issues bringing different perspectives, but actually transforming the central history. The people who are leading our dominant government and media institutions actually are, in many cases, don't understand the history, like the objective central history. You know, I think of Stuart Hall and how Stuart Hall said, you know, how do we understand a cup of tea? Right. This thing that sort of connotes Britishness. But what's actually in it? Empire, right? Where did the herbs and spices, the sugar, where did those come from? They came from empire, right? And if you don't know that, that's not like a different perspective, right? On what makes Britain. That's like, you don't know the history if you don't grasp that. And so I think we have to challenge and be powerful in the way that we challenge the society and the people, as Sarah said, who have the power to greenlight stories, to sort of say what is a story and what isn't. To challenge them and say, are you actually able, do you have the qualifications for leadership at this moment? If you don't understand feminist history, if you don't understand queer history, disability studies and politics, you must be at least literate with those things to lead at this moment, to create and to cover these things. So that's what I want to say.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. Sarah, I'm going to come back to you before coming to you, Kerry, just because you obviously spoke a lot about historical interventions and those models being there. You know, they've long been there. So I just wonder if you could just speak to the importance of educating people about those models in addition to broader issues, you know, and happenings like empire.
Yeah, of course. I mean, at first, I agree with everything Chenjerai just said. And I mean, I think the challenge here is that, you know, in neoliberal societies, our educational systems aren't much better off than our media systems are. And so, unfortunately, you know, the thing I'm pointing to, which is that we would all be having more productive, more complex, and deeper conversations about race and racism, and particularly better conversations about Blackness, if the stories told in media were being told by the folks that can best tell those stories. It's also the case that those stories often aren't told in educational settings. And so we would need a second conference, of course, about about educational reform. I can't speak for the UK context, but certainly in the US, it's a mess. And so I think one of the... Yeah, right. So I think one of the important things is that so much of the work of what media does is educate people. And often media corporations aren't willing to acknowledge that because they're concerned about making money or, you know, serving particular political ideologies or, you know, what have you. But in fact, they're the primary source of many people across the world for questions of history and questions of politics. And I think that that speaks specifically to why it's so important to have the alternative forms of media and for the kinds of change that we really want to happen to actually be supported, funded, held up, and recentered, because telling different histories, I mean, Chenjerai's show Uncivil is a great example of this, where they tell the alternative histories of the Civil War, which unfortunately in the United States, people still don't really understand, you know, what the Civil War was about and what happened and who did it and why. And that becomes a form of public education. And it's programming like that, and it's stories like that, and it's education like that that can be achieved through media. And the question is doing the work to draw that storytelling into the center.
Thank you very much. And Kerry-Anne, if you could speak on that a bit. I mean, to what extent, you know, Sarah's spoken about, you know, drawing those stories into the center, and often, you know, in this country, media organizations like the Canary, like Gal Them, are kind of seen as not mainstream and on the periphery. Can you talk to that a bit, and, you know, to what extent you feel you are able to kind of intervene in dominant discourses, or do you feel that that's even what you're there to do?
I think for us, it was definitely what we're there to do. I don't have a degree, which is the other thing, which is, you know, getting into journalism in this country without a degree. And as we know, universities are predominantly white institutions. So that was another way. It was kind of like, how do you get, you know, more people in? It's also looking at all of the pathways into journalism that themselves are already being gatekept by sort of white supremacy. One of the things we discussed, so we really set out to be not a niche outlet. You know, we wanted to disrupt mainstream narratives, and we felt we could, and we were incredibly successful at that. But what we discovered was they really don't like that. if you're actually in a position, I think they sort of almost like us to be sort of these niche outlets that, you know, okay, who are you chatting to? A couple of 100,000 people, not a big deal. But we started speaking to millions upon millions upon millions of people and overtaking the readership of kind of long established outlets like The Spectator, New Statesman, those types. Even The Economist, we were beating their website at one point. And we just had the entire kind of weapons of the establishment turned on us. And it wasn't like we didn't expect that to happen. It just seemed like a really sort of vainglorious ambition at the beginning of just like, why would they even care about us? But one of the things I always say is, if you want to unmask a performative liberal, put them in front of a black woman who succeeded on her own terms. And you will see that Karen mask replace the liberal mask immediately, which is what happened to us. It's suddenly I was just character assassinated. I was suddenly, you know, 1 minute I was Hitler, then I'm Boudica, then I'm somebody, like it was any sort of character from history that would chill your very soul. That was, you know, kind of who I was and who the canary was as a sort of almost like a totem. And you know, literally, so we realized it wasn't enough that they would bar us from speaking on their platforms. It was that if we build platforms that then start to get the kind of traction, it means that we can affect the narrative, which we certainly did around the 2017 general election, then they will come for you. And they won't let you speak on your platform. So they attacked our advertisers, trying to cut off our revenue. You know, they smeared us in efforts to get people to turn on us and kind of make us anathema. And it was a really like painful period of time just to learn, you know, some people who are sort of very, oh, I'm a lefty and I'm, you know, proud lefty and all this stuff, how quickly they would pull away under that kind of duress, under that kind of threat and ostracization. That was disappointing. But on the really like other side of the positive side of that, we saw some really incredible solidarity, and a lot of that actually came from the Black community, you know, and other, I don't want to say Black community like we're homogenous, because we're not, but certainly Black socialists and white socialists kind of coming together almost in this shared experience. I think it was like people said, I think we're starting to get it now. That, you know, they're trying to keep us apart, and any engine that is in service of bringing us together is going to be attacked. And so we need to protect those institutions. So I know we're going to get onto solutions, but I really would like to touch on one briefly now, which is we have to go out and support those media outlets. I would love it if you subscribe to the Canary, but that's not why I'm saying this. Subscribe to Galdem, subscribe to so any of these, when you see these organizations are doing this great work, it's not enough just to go, oh, that's nice. And then keep your subscription to a white supremacist outlet that is actually the opposite of this thing that you were wanting to support. Literally vote with your wallet. You know, cancel your subscriptions to those mainstream media outlets that have failed to serve you, failed to serve us, failed to serve all of us, and support the organizations that are, whoever those organizations happen to be. That would be, I think, one of the biggest things that we can do personally to make a difference there, is to basically tool up those outlets that are trying to do things differently, reward the effort that they're putting in and the sort of duress that they're put under just for doing their jobs.
Great, thank you very much. Gosh, we really haven't got enough time, and I've not asked you any questions that have been posted in the chat. I feel
Sorry.
So I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm choosing a question. I'm not going to say who's posted it, but I'm going to ask you this just because I know in the UK, certainly it comes up quite a lot, particularly from white editors. And the question is, we've tried to get Black people and other minorities involved in writing and producing media for us, and we haven't had much luck. I think mostly because we can't pay much. If anything, can people in the UK who aren't white British aren't able to donate time and skills freely? Do you think that's a factor? What else do you think is a factor? So I know I've heard quite a lot, you know, editors saying, we've tried to employ Black and brown people and they're just not out there, or we just can't get them to work. What's your response to that kind of issue, that, you know, problem?
Yeah, one thing I would...
Yeah, Chenjerai.
Oh, I want to hear from Kerry because she's understands, you know, a lot about this. I would say in our version of it over here in the States, you know, this is definitely a big thing as well. And I've experienced it as somebody in leadership of creative projects, right? Looking like there's not people in what's called the pipeline, which is, I think, a problematic extractive metaphor that we maybe should leave aside, but because people, you know, but yeah, like, are there enough journalists? I'm trying to find them. You know, and I think this is actually where the radical abolition politics that, you know, Black feminists have brought to police can actually help us in thinking about what my friend Malav calls almost like media abolition. Because what does a journalist of color who wants to learn this face? You know, you often are facing having to work and produce your materials for free, right? While working in other jobs, maybe being in school, maybe negotiating family conditions, right? And then, you know, maybe like entering a really competitive kind of application process, and then entering an institution in which your colleagues are often not educated at all on issues of race, and may have all various kinds of biases. And so I find when editors say that, you know, so that those all point to things outside of the newsroom that need to change. And in the same way that, like, you know, these discourses of police reform don't look at the communities that we need to build, that actually funding police are doing. But there's also things, really quickly, I just want to say, that can be done. And you know, I have to shout out Media 2070, Free Press's Media Reparations Project. Hopefully the link has been placed in the chat. There's all kinds of things there. But I also would say, often those editors who are asking that at the last minute. Like, they're not thinking about that till their search didn't produce the kind of people they want. When you should be thinking about that way early on, when you're looking upwards and looking at budgets and looking at the racial and sort of, you know, gender and priorities that are built into your budget about who's going to be supported. Because if you're really committed, you're thinking about it then, not just using that lack of pipeline as an excuse to maintain the status quo.
Thank you. Sarah, would you like to respond to that as well? No?
I'll pass to Kerry-Anne.
Yeah, go for it, Kerry.
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things. I mean, it was harder for us at the beginning because literally we set up with £500 that we'd all chipped in ourselves, that just bought us a website and an accountant. We had no steady source of income. And literally all we could do at the beginning was say, right, we're going to carve up whatever pie we end up with in terms of income. This is the percentages that we're going to cut it up as. We didn't even have salaries, you know, and we all kind of went in under that of like, we're happy we've got a fair, we're going to divvy up this pie fairly. Whether the pie is like a mince pie or it's like a steak pie, it's going to be divvied up fairly. That was the first thing. But still, you're in a situation where, you know who that's going to privilege? Middle-class white people, you know, because they, you know, maybe they could, mum and dad can pay their rent for 6 months, you know, while they're having their jollies, you know, trying out this journalism thing. So everything that's difficult about doing this also privileges people who are already privileged. So like, that's just a reality you've got to address at the beginning, is this is going to be tough, and you need to, certainly what we did was just, we made sure that when we were talking to people about being a part of this, they knew how hard this was going to be. This is going to be hard. But we are going to make it as fair in terms of remuneration as it's possible to make a thing. And however big this pie gets, it will stay that fair. So now, for example, there is a fixed 20% cap. I can earn 20%, more than 20% more than the most junior person in our organization, which means if I want a pay rise, everybody gets a pay rise, because it's literally outlawed in our organization that there could be a bigger pay differential from top to bottom than 20%. So those are ways, I think, that over time you make sure you keep it fair, because what tends to happen in media is the people that find it do want to make a lot of money from it ultimately. And so they will expand their take, and then they will contract the take of the journalists. And surprise, it will be the journalists of colour that get the smallest portion of that pay at the end of the day. So what I would say, I know it's Unity, I know the organisation, and I know what you're up against. I would say you need to be having conversations with people of colour now. You can't put it off until the day that you can pay people the way you would like to pay them. I'd like all of our journalists to be earning 70 grand a year. Like, that would be wonderful, but we're just not there yet. So it's finding the people who can do that now. And by being fair and by being an organisation that is cooperative and collaborative, you can ensure their commitment over time and make sure they're rewarded then. When your organisation starts bringing in money, be it in subscriptions or however else you do it, that you make sure you reward that loyalty and keep that pie distribution fair all the way through.
Thank you very much. And that kind of speaks to solutions as well, which is how we want to wrap up, and we are already over time. So Sarah, I'd just like to come back to you, just if you can just speak to solutions, and obviously we could talk about that for hours, but in a nutshell, key things that you think need to happen.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the media ecologies in country to country are different, but as Chenjerai and Kerry have pointed out, some of the logics are the same. The ideological logics are the same. The consumer logics in many ways are the same. And I think that, as Chenjerai said, if we're really going to be committed to reform, you know, I'm very focused on thinking about whose stories we tell, who's telling them, are they at the center, are they at the margins? But, or I should say, and it's not a but. And of course, we need to think about new models of media, right? I mean, the points that Chenjerai and Kerry made about being able to pay folks. Again, you know, and not to complicate things, because I did that already when you asked me about education, but that's a problem that's outside of just media. That's very much about our economic systems and about the kinds of economic reforms that we need to see as countries, as communities, that we can strive to make in media organizations, but we can only get so far with so long as there's economic inequalities as they currently exist in our larger societies. So, you know, I think that's, again, maybe a longer conversation than we have time for the panel, but that is certainly, you know, a commitment to these kind of structural shifts is foundational to all of these questions, you know.
Great, thank you very much. And a final word to Chenjerai. I know you posted something on the chat that you wanted to mention in terms of solutions. Do you want to just talk about that briefly?
I just would say, you know, two things. That I have not given up on public media as an important site of struggle, and I think we should look at the ways that some of the private media companies try to act like they're more advanced and public media isn't. And we should, I think, reject that discourse and fight within our public media institutions to make them stronger. You know, the work of Sarah I encourage you to check out her work, because you'll see a range of media being made. And also movements, right, outside of media, like just radical organizing in the streets that can pressure, that can set the agenda of what we're talking about, and that can empower people at multiple locations to then push and make the transformation as they need to. And of course, everybody subscribe to the Canary. I can't wait to hop off, so I'm gonna subscribe, get involved, you know, share, and let's lift that up above all this other noise and nonsense.
Great, thank you very much. And I'm now going to let you all hop off. But before you do, I just want to say a huge thank you to the three of you for your fantastic contributions, really fascinating discussion. And, you know, finally, also, thank you to the Media Reform Coalition. It is, as you probably know, a voluntary organisation that survives mostly on thin air and some kind donations. So thanks so much for putting these debates on. We would also like to acknowledge the support of the Canary, of course. Thank you very much, Kerry-Anne. The Independent Media Association, Byline Times, Squawk Box, Bywire News, and Manchester Meteor. And if you would like to support the work of the Media Reform Coalition, please do. Then please follow the links on the closing slide. So thanks again. A virtual round of applause. Well, I can give you an actual round of applause. And I know
we also thank the chair.
Yeah, and your intro was fantastic.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks. Well, it's great to meet you all, albeit virtually, and hopefully next time we see each other, it will be in person. Thanks, everybody, for joining us, and no doubt we will see you again this time next year. Take care.